Hi, today we're going to look at the extraordinary life of Christopher Lee. If you enjoy it, please like and subscribe. It helps a lot. Thank you. When you hear the name Christopher Lee, depending on which generation you are, it will conjure up images of Dracula, the Wicker Man, Scaramanga in the Bond film The Man with the Golden Gun, or Saruman in Peter Jackson's Lord of the Rings trilogy. However, not many people are aware of the remarkable life Lee had outside of his day job. Born Christopher Frank Carandini Lee on May the 27th, 1922 in Belgravia, London, to a lieutenant colonel veteran of both World War I and the Boer War, and an Italian countess. Through Lee's mother, Contessa Estella Marie Carandini di Sarzan, Lee was connected to one of the oldest royal families in European history. In fact, the family is traceable back to the 1st century AD, and it includes no less a renowned figure than the Emperor Charlemagne. Lee and his family actually shared a coat of arms with Charlemagne, even after centuries had passed. We'll be coming back to Charlemagne later. After Lee's parents divorced in the late 1920s, his mother remarried the uncle of none other than Ian Fleming, who would go on to create the literary and film legend James Bond. Incredibly, Fleming and Lee had both worked in the Special Forces during World War II, more of that later as well, and Fleming is said to have partly based the character of James Bond on Lee himself. This leaves us in a strange position of imagining a world where Lee became the first James Bond instead of Sean Connery. In the early summer of 1939, whilst he was passing through Paris, a 17-year-old Lee found himself attending the public execution of serial killer Eugene Weidman by guillotine. Weidmann had embarked on a series of kidnaps and murders for financial gain. The execution was a debacle. The crowd was so unruly that the execution was delayed beyond its traditional dawn time. The later and lighter time of the event enabled a secret cameraman to film the execution from an apartment overlooking the square. I won't include the grisly footage in this video, but there is a link to it in the description for those that wish to look at it. I guess young Christopher must be in this photograph of the crowd shot that I am showing here. Afterwards, the crowd rushed forward, mopping up the blood with their hankies. It was the last public use of the guillotine in France. At the outbreak of World War II, Lee signed up with the Royal Air Force to become a fighter pilot. However, he was diagnosed with a failed optic nerve whilst he was close to finishing his training. He was forbidden from flying, much to his disappointment. However, he had himself transferred to the RAF intelligence unit instead. During his time in the Second World War, Lee was moved to a position where he was kept busy conducting espionage, sabotage and reconnaissance in occupied Europe against Axis powers. The organisation he worked for was called the Special Operations Executive, or SOE, though it was also called the Ministry of Ungentlemanly Warfare. While Lee never opened up about his time with the SOE, and his files with them are still classified to this day, he did once give this statement: "I've seen many men die right in front of me, so many in fact that I've become almost hardened to it. Having seen the worst that human beings can do to each other, the results of torture, mutilation, and seeing someone blown to pieces by a bomb, you develop a kind of shell. But you had to, otherwise we would never have won." While Lee was in Italy during the Second World War, he managed to find time to climb Mount Vesuvius. Lee picked his time wisely as Vesuvius erupted 3 days later. For the final few months of his service, Lee, fluent in 5 languages including French and German, was tasked with tracking down Nazi war criminals alongside the Central Registry of War Criminals and Security Suspects. He saw Nazi concentration camps firsthand. Of his time with the organisation, Lee said, "We were given dossiers of what they'd done and told to find them, interrogate them as much as we could, and then hand them over to the appropriate authority." Lee then retired from the RAF in 1946 with the rank of Flight Lieutenant. Although his service records remain classified, and Lee himself was reluctant to discuss anything about his service, after his retirement he'd been individually decorated for battlefield bravery by the Czech, Yugoslav, British and Polish governments. Seen here are his medals. He was also on personal terms with Josip Broz Tito, presumably after their mutual involvement with the partisan resistance movement, which was widely cited as the most effective resistance movement in occupied Europe. Despite any initial setbacks, Lee proved to be one of the most prolific actors of all time. In 2 different years, 1955 and 1970, Lee acted in 9 films within the span of the year. In total, he appeared in more than 220 feature films. In 1966, Lee took the role of Rasputin, the sinister holy man who served as an advisor to the Russian royal family before their execution and his own murder. This bit of casting has a haunting prologue.
What is your name?
Sonia.
Sonia. Little Sonia. You're very beautiful, little Sonia.
As a child in the 1920s, Lee met 2 men, one of them Prince Yusupov and the other Grand Duke Pavlovich. These were the 2 men that were famous for being behind the assassination of Rasputin.
I don't suppose that you have any idea about the identity of this lady. And I'll tell you exactly who she is. Her name, Maria Rasputin. Yes. Rasputin's daughter.
One of Lee's lifelong friends was his frequent co-star Peter Cushing, most famous as Grand Moff Tarkin in Star Wars. Whilst Lee often played Dracula in the Hammer horror films, Cushing would often play his mortal enemy, Van Helsing. Lee and Cushing made 24 films together and remained friends throughout their lives. According to Lee, he first interacted with Peter Cushing on the set of The Curse of Frankenstein in the late 1950s. Cast as Frankenstein's monster, Lee was furious to discover that he didn't have any lines. When he confronted Cushing to gripe about it in the dressing room, Cushing replied, "You're lucky, I've read the script." No wonder they became good friends. Of course, Lee got some good scripts too, one of them being The Cult and Brit Eklund. As mentioned before, Lee spoke no less than 5 languages fluently. As well as English, French and German, Lee was also fluent in Italian and Spanish, while also claiming to be reasonably familiar with Greek, Russian and Swedish. It proved useful when he could dub his own voice in those languages as he became a film star. According to Lee himself, he was always enamoured by the character of Gandalf while reading Lord of the Rings throughout his life, as it fed his fascination with magic and the occult. He initially auditioned to play Gandalf when Peter Jackson was casting the Lord of the Rings movies, but his age and physical limitations were judged to be too much for all the fighting and horseback riding that he would have to do. Ian McKellen, 17 years younger than Lee, was deemed to be the more suitable choice for Gandalf. Lee was instead offered the role of Saruman, which Jackson once quipped that he would never have to explain to Lee at all due to his immense knowledge of Tolkien's world. When it came time to film Saruman's death in The Lord of the Rings, The Return of the King, director Peter Jackson attempted to give Lee some direction on how to behave and sound when he was stabbed in the back. While presumably giving Jackson a 1,000-yard stare, Lee asked Jackson if he knew what someone sounded like when stabbed in the back, following it up with, "Because I do." Not only was Lee a fan of Lord of the Rings, but by chance in the 1950s he met the author Tolkien in the Eagle and Child pub in Oxford. Rare in the entertainment industry, and arguably rare in Western society, Lee only ever married once, to Danish actress Birgit Kroenke. They were married in 1961 and remained together until Lee's death in 2015. Lee's grandparents were actually responsible for bringing Australia its first opera company. Lee himself would lend his incredible voice to opera pieces as well throughout the 80s and 90s, in between acting in films. Despite his initial dabbling in more traditional music and his contributions to film soundtracks, Lee was utterly enamoured with the heavy metal genre. Lee became a fan of metal in the early 70s when he first heard Black Sabbath, whose guitarist Tony Iommi reciprocated the respect the actor had for his band and the genre it spawned. In a 2013 promotional video for one of Lee's own albums, he told Iommi, "You are the father of metal," to which the guitarist replied, "But you're the one that started it, really, because we used to go and watch Dracula and the horror films you did, and that's what influenced us." His first foray into singing metal music came when he worked with the power metal group Rhapsody of Fire on their album Symphony of Enchanted Lands 2, The Dark Secret, in 2004. He was already in his 80s. Lee took his ancient royal roots seriously, especially when it came to his entry into metal music. His third foray into the genre which was also his first full metal album, was titled Charlemagne by the Sword and the Cross. It told the story of Charlemagne, with Lee playing his ancestor in both the songs and a music video that was shot for one of the songs. By the time of his collaboration with Man of War, Lee was already a bona fide metal recording artist in his own right, having released the galloping symphonic metal album Charlemagne by the Sword and the Cross earlier in 2010. On it, the actor turned musician, who released the record's lead single, Let Legend Mark Me as the King, on his 90th birthday, chronicled the history of the first Holy Roman Emperor in sung and spoken parts. He was, in fact, my ancestor, and we can prove it, Lee told an audience at a speech in University College in Dublin. 3 years later, the actor took things to a new level of confidence and power with the heavier, more majestic Charlemagne, The Omens of Death, which was arranged by guitarist Richie Fulker right before he replaced K.K. Downing in Judas Priest. Lee also enjoyed putting out high-volume Christmas carols. A 2012 EP, A Heavy Metal Christmas, featured renditions of Little Drummer Boy, Silent Night. Also on this release was his version of My Way. Due to his many contributions to the headbanging arts, both through music and film, Lee received the Spirit of Metal Award from Tony Iommi at the Metal Hammer Golden Gods Award show in 2010. I have great belief that things, no matter what they are, music, literature, anything in life, should, from time to time, surprise people, and that's what I believe in, surprising people, he told Metal Hammer. Heavy metal has, since its very beginning, surprised me in the best sense of the word, and to be involved in that and to show people that even now I can still surprise my audience is very important to me. I've spent my entire career taking risks. Acting is a risk. It has to be. I've never been afraid, and I've done my best to take those risks. Christopher Lee died on June the 7th in 2015. A truly extraordinary man.